On the night of August 23, 1986, 14 people were eliminated across a remote moonshine operation in Pike County, Kentucky, in what would become known as the Blackberry Ridge Massacre. All adults, all members of the Pritchard family's distilling crew. The method was ruthless. Shotguns fired at close range, hunting rifles from elevated positions, and fires set to erase evidence that couldn't be hidden. The perpetrators weren't federal agents or rival drug cartels. They were 4 members of the Wilson family, a father and his 3 sons, moving through the August darkness like predators who knew every trail, every creek crossing, every hiding spot in these mountains. The FBI would later call it one of the most brutal acts of retribution in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't about territory, wasn't about a drug operation, wasn't even about generations-old family hatred. It was about a copper moonshine still worth $22,000 that disappeared on a Tuesday night in July. And one man's unshakable belief that theft demanded blood payment, according to codes written in these mountains, long before any government existed to say otherwise. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Pike County sprawled across 788 square miles of eastern Kentucky in 1986. Pressed against the West Virginia border, where the Cumberland Mountains rose like ancient walls guarding secrets older than the nation itself. The terrain was unforgiving. Steep ridges covered with oak, hickory, and pine, rising over 3,000 feet. Their valleys so narrow that entire communities existed in hollows, where the sun only reached for a few hours each day. Population stood around 72,000, most concentrated in Pikeville, the county seat, with the rest scattered across hollers and ridges in communities so isolated they might as well have been different countries. August in eastern Kentucky meant temperatures climbing into the low 90s during the day, humidity so thick you could barely breathe, dropping to the high 60s at night when fog rolled down from the ridges and turned the world ghostly. The air smelled like tobacco curing in barns, wood smoke from cooking fires, honeysuckle growing wild along creek banks, and underneath it all, the sweet fermentation smell of corn mash that anyone who knew moonshine could identify instantly. At night, you could hear the entire hollow settling, insects screaming in the heat, distant dogs barking, the occasional rumble of coal trucks on Route 23, hauling black diamonds that were worth less every year. But 1986 was a catastrophic year for coal country. The industry that had sustained eastern Kentucky for nearly a century was in free fall, crushed by mechanization that eliminated thousands of jobs, environmental regulations that shut down marginal operations, and Western coal that undercut Appalachian prices by 40%. Mines that had employed entire communities now sat abandoned, their portals sealed, their equipment rusting in the rain. In Pike County, unemployment officially hit 22%, but everyone knew the real number was closer to 40% when you counted people who'd given up looking for work that didn't exist. Men who'd spent their lives underground, breathing coal dust, destroying their bodies for union wages that once meant something, now had nothing. Disability checks that barely covered rent, food stamps that bought humiliation at the grocery store, and a growing understanding that the world had moved on and left them behind. In that economic wasteland, moonshine wasn't just a business. It was survival. The only viable industry left for people with more pride than options. The culture of illegal distilling ran deeper than law, deeper than morality, into the bedrock of Appalachian identity itself. Making shine was what mountain people had done for 2 centuries, ever since their Scots-Irish ancestors brought the knowledge across the Atlantic and discovered that these mountains had everything needed for perfect whiskey: clear spring water that ran cold even in August, corn that grew in bottomland along creeks, isolation that kept federal agents at bay, and a network of customers who preferred untaxed liquor to the legal kind that cost 3 times as much and didn't taste any better. By 1986, with coal dying and tobacco following close behind, moonshine represented the last way for families to make real money without leaving the mountains that had been home for 8 generations. The risk was federal prison, 5 to 10 years if you got caught with a still, but most people figured that was better than watching your children go hungry. While some politician in Frankfurt or Washington talked about economic development that never came, the Wilson family had been making moonshine since 1889, when Earl Wilson's great-grandfather set up his first, still in a hollow so remote that even neighbors didn't know exactly where it was. That legacy meant something in Pike County, meant reputation and respect and the knowledge that Wilson Shine was the best product you could buy. Smooth as silk, strong enough to strip paint, and worth every penny of premium price. Earl Thomas Wilson was 62 years old that August, though he looked closer to 75. He stood 5'11", lean and ropey, with the kind of wiriness that came from a lifetime of physical labor that never quite provided enough calories. His face was deeply lined, weathered like old boot leather, with eyes so pale blue they almost looked colorless in certain light. A thick beard, more gray than brown, covered his jaw and grew halfway down his chest. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen with arthritis that made every movement painful, fingers permanently stained from handling copper and corn mash and 1,000 other substances that had soaked into his skin over 6 decades. A scar ran from his right ear down to his collarbone, a souvenir from 1964, when a still exploded and nearly killed him, burning away the hearing in that ear and leaving tissue that looked like melted wax. Every morning, Earl woke at 4 a.m. in the house his grandfather had built in 1912, made coffee in a percolator so old the handle had been replaced 3 times, and sat at the kitchen table smoking hand-rolled cigarettes while he planned his day. He didn't talk during those early hours, just sat in darkness, drank coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and thought about the business of staying alive in a world that didn't value men like him anymore. He'd married Sarah Jane Combs in 1946, right after coming home from the Pacific, where he'd served with the 1st Marine Division at Palayu and Okinawa, seen things that still woke him up screaming 40 years later. They'd had 3 sons. James was 38 now, built like his father with the same quiet intensity and work ethic. Robert was 35, bigger than James, stronger, with a temper that required careful management. Curtis was 31, the baby, still trying to prove he was as tough as his older brothers. still seeking his father's approval in ways that worried Sarah because she knew where that kind of need could lead. Sarah was 61, a thin woman whose face showed every hard year, hands as rough as Earl's from decades of keeping a household running on money that barely existed. What Earl valued most wasn't the money from moonshine, though God knew they needed every penny. With 3 adult sons, trying to establish their own households, what he valued was legacy, the knowledge that the Wilson name meant something in Pike County, meant quality, honesty, and a product that 4 generations had perfected. His great-grandfather had developed their recipe during Prohibition, when making liquor was both rebellion and survival. That recipe, passed father to son for 97 years, was the only inheritance Earl had to give his boys in a world where men like them owned nothing else of value. James Earl Wilson was 38 years old that summer, though the lines around his eyes made him look older. He stood 6 new, broad through the shoulders from years of manual labor, with arms corded with muscle built from hauling 50-pound bags of sugar and wrestling copper coils into position. His face was angular like his father's, with the same pale blue eyes that seemed to see through whatever you were saying to the truth underneath. He kept his brown hair cut short, his beard trimmed neat, and moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that one mistake in the moonshine business could mean prison or death. Every morning James woke at 5 o'clock in the small house he'd built on his father's property, made breakfast for his wife Linda and their 3 children, then drove to whatever site they were running shine that week. Locations changed regularly, never more than 3 runs from the same spot before moving on, a security measure that had kept the Wilson operation free from federal interference for decades. James was methodical, patient, the kind of man who thought 3 steps ahead and rarely made mistakes. His father had taught him that moonshining required intelligence as much as skill, that the families who survived were the ones who planned carefully and never got greedy. Robert Dale Wilson was 35, shorter than James at 5'10", but built thicker, stockier, with a barrel chest and legs like tree trunks. He had the Wilson features, the angular face, the intense eyes, but where James was calm and calculating, Robert was volatile, quicker to anger, slower to forgive perceived insults. A scar bisected his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a bar fight in Pikeville when he was 26, a reminder that Robert's temper had cost him before and would probably cost him again. He'd married young at 19, had 2 daughters, but his wife had left him in 1983, taken the girls to Ohio, and he hadn't seen them since. That abandonment had hardened something in Robert, made him more dangerous, more willing to cross lines that other men wouldn't. He lived in a trailer on the Wilson property, spent his evenings drinking Budweiser and cleaning his hunting rifles with obsessive care that bordered on ritualistic, talking to himself in low tones that worried his brothers. Curtis Wayne Wilson was 31, the youngest, standing 6'1", lean and rangy with nervous energy that made him seem younger than his years. He had darker hair than his brothers, took after their mother's side in looks, with brown eyes instead of the pale blue Wilson trademark. Curtis had tried to leave Pike County once, driven to Lexington with dreams of construction work and a different life, lasted 8 months before coming home, defeated by a world that looked down on mountain people, that heard his accent and assumed he was stupid, that offered him minimum wage jobs and expected gratitude. He'd come back to the family business with his pride damaged, desperate to prove he belonged, that he was as tough and capable as James and Robert. The Wilson still was legendary in Pike County, talked about in hushed tones by people who knew moonshine, envied by competitors who understood its value. Earl had spent 3 years building it, from 1979 to 1982, assembling components piece by piece, saving every dollar from production runs to invest in equipment that would outlast him and serve his sons after he was gone. The still itself was a masterpiece of mountain engineering, 500-gallon capacity, all copper construction, with custom coils Earl had designed himself, based on knowledge passed down through 4 generations. The copper alone was worth $15,000, maybe more given the metal's increasing value. But the still's real worth was in its production capability. A 500-gallon run produced approximately 65 gallons of pure shine, worth $50 per gallon wholesale, $3,250 per run. Running twice a week meant 6,500 weekly, 26,000 monthly, over 300,000 annually. In Pike County in 1986, where median household income was $14,000, the Wilsons still represented wealth beyond most people's imagination. It was the family's future, their security, the only asset they possessed that couldn't be taken by economic collapse or government policy. The still was hidden in a hollow 2 miles up Blackberry Ridge, accessible only by a trail Earl and his sons had carved through forest, so thick that even in daylight you could walk within 50 feet and never see the operation. The site had everything required: a cold spring that provided water year-round, thick tree cover that dispersed smoke, and approaches that could be watched from elevated positions. They'd operated from that location for 4 years without federal interference, without local law enforcement nosing around, building a reputation for quality product and reliable delivery. The still wasn't just equipment. It was Earl Wilson's legacy, proof that a man with intelligence and determination could survive in a world trying to crush people like him. He'd taught his sons every aspect of operation, from mash fermentation to distillation temperature control, passing down knowledge that represented 97 years of accumulated expertise. That still was supposed to employ Wilson men for another 2 generations, supposed to feed grandchildren and great-grandchildren, supposed to be the foundation on which the family built whatever future was possible in these dying mountains. On July 22, 1986, a Tuesday night when temperatures had finally dropped below 80 degrees and fog rolled through the hollows, thick enough that you couldn't see 20 feet, that still disappeared. Earl had checked the site at sunset, everything normal, mash fermenting, security undisturbed. When he returned at dawn on July 23rd, the clearing was empty. Not just the still itself, but the copper coils, the thermometers, the collection jugs, every piece of equipment that represented 3 years of work and $22,000 in investment. Gone, vanished, like it had never existed. Earl stood in that clearing for 30 minutes, just staring at the rectangular patch of flattened grass where the still had been, at the cold spring still trickling water, at the forest surrounding him that suddenly felt hostile instead of protective. His breathing came shallow and fast, his hands opening and closing at his sides, rage building like pressure in a sealed vessel that had to find release or explode. Earl drove home from Blackberry Ridge. On July 23rd, in silence, his 1979 Ford F-150, rattling over logging roads that had turned to dust in the summer heat. The 20-minute journey felt like hours, his mind cycling through rage, disbelief, and cold calculation about what came next. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he'd exhausted every legal option. Police were 30 miles away in Pikeville and wouldn't care about an illegal still being stolen. You couldn't report theft of contraband without admitting to federal crimes. Courts offered no remedy for moonshiners. The law had failed before he'd even considered using it. Sarah met him at the door, saw his face, understood immediately. "They took it," Earl said. His voice was flat, empty. "The still's gone. Everything." "Who?" "I don't know yet, but I will." There's only 3 families in Pike County who knew that location. Only 3 crews who had the trucks and manpower to move 500 gallons of copper through forest in the middle of the night. Somebody talked. Somebody planned this. Somebody's going to answer for it. That evening, Earl sat on his porch, drinking black coffee, watching the sun set behind the ridges, tobacco fields in the valley below, turning golden in the fading light. His neighbors, the Combs family, were working their small patch, 4 generations harvesting by hand, like people had done for 200 years, the smell of green tobacco carrying on the still air. Normal life, ordinary August evening, while Earl's world collapsed around him. He thought about the 3 years he'd spent building that still, every dollar saved, every piece of copper carefully shaped and soldered, every hour of work that represented hope for his family's future. Thought about his sons who depended on that income, who had families to feed, who'd learned the business from him with the understanding that moonshine would sustain them when nothing else could. That still wasn't just equipment. It was identity, legacy, proof that Earl Wilson mattered in a world that treated mountain people like they were disposable. Without it, he was just another broke old man in a dying county, watching his family slip toward poverty with no way to stop it. The rage that had been building since dawn finally crystallized into decision. He stood up, walked inside, called his sons. They had to eat, and gathered at the kitchen table within an hour, faces grim, already suspecting why their father had summoned them. "The still's gone," Earl said without preamble. "Stolen Tuesday night." James's jaw tightened. "You sure?" "I'm sure." checked every approach, looked for signs of breakdown or federal raid. Nothing. This was theft, pure and simple. Robert's hands curled into fists on the table. Who? Earl pulled out a notebook, opened it to a page where he'd been writing names. 3 possibilities. The Pritchard crew out of Virgie. They've been asking questions about our operation for 6 months, trying to figure out our recipe, our production capacity. Tommy Hatfield's boys from Phelps. They've got equipment, they've got connections. They know these mountains. Or the McCoy outfit from Elkhorn City. They've been expanding, trying to take over distribution in 3 counties. Could be any of them, or all of them working together. Curtis leaned forward, voice tight with anger. What do we do? Earl looked at his 3 sons, at the men he'd raised to value family and honor above everything else, who'd learned from childhood that in these mountains, you protected what was yours or you lost everything. We find out who took it. We give them one chance to return what's ours. They don't. That chance, he paused. We handle it mountain style. What's that mean exactly? James asked quietly, though he already knew. Earl met his oldest son's eyes. Means we make sure everyone in Pike County understands that stealing from the Wilson family has consequences. Lester Pritchard was 47 years old that summer, a big man at 6'2" and 260 pounds, most of it muscle built from 40 years of farm work and moonshining. He'd grown up in Virgie, a small community 12 miles north of Pikeville, started helping his father run shine at age 10, owned his own operation by 20. Pritchard Moonshine employed 11 men, ran 2 separate still sites, and grossed approximately $400,000 annually. Lester was smart, aggressive, willing to undercut competitors on price and expand territory through intimidation when necessary. He'd never liked Earl Wilson, thought the old man was arrogant, trading on reputation instead of innovation, charging premium prices for product that wasn't worth the markup. When Lester's cousin, who worked as a hunting guide, mentioned seeing the Wilson Stills location during a tracking trip in May, Lester had seen opportunity. A 500-gallon copper still would let him double production, undercut Wilson prices, and dominate Pike County moonshine distribution. The decision to take it had been easy. Getting away with it required more planning. The Pritchard operation was based out of an old tobacco barn 5 miles outside Virgie, a structure that looked abandoned, but housed a sophisticated distilling operation behind false walls. The barn sat on 40 acres Lester owned, accessible by a private road, surrounded by forest that provided privacy from neighbors and law enforcement. Inside, 2 250-gallon stills ran continuously, producing 130 gallons weekly, 6,500 in revenue that supported 11 families and maintained equipment. Lester's crew foreman was his younger brother Dale, 43 years old, built compact and strong, with a reputation for keeping workers in line through fear and occasional violence. Dale had done time in federal prison from 1976 to 1980 for moonshining, came out harder, meaner, more willing to cross lines that Lester preferred to keep others from knowing he'd crossed. The crew itself was a mix of Pritchard relatives and men who needed money badly enough to work for a boss who paid 20% below market rate and demanded absolute loyalty. Most were in their 20s and 30s, hard men from dying coal towns working moonshine because tobacco farming didn't pay enough, and coal jobs were gone. Among the crew were Michael Webb, 31, whose wife was pregnant with their fourth child, Danny Combs, 26, saving money to buy a trailer, Vernon Hall, 34, supporting his mother who had black lung from years working in company housing, Jackie Sturgill, 28, trying to stay out of prison by maintaining employment, any employment, even illegal. These weren't bad men. They weren't thieves in their own minds. They were workers following orders from a boss who'd told them the copper still they'd hauled down from Blackberry Ridge on July 22nd was salvage from an abandoned operation, legal to claim under mountain law that said unused equipment was fair game. Most of them didn't know about Earl Wilson's claim, didn't understand they'd just marked themselves for elimination in a blood feud they hadn't even known they were starting. Lester Pritchard knew, though. He knew exactly whose still he'd stolen, knew Earl Wilson's reputation, knew the old man would come looking for answers. Lester had made his calculation. Wilson was 62, had 3 sons, operated on reputation more than violence. Lester had 11 men, was in his prime, and figured intimidation would keep the Wilsons quiet. That miscalculation would cost 14 men their lives. On July 28th, 6 days after the theft, Earl Wilson drove his F-150 to Virgie and found Lester Pritchard at his barn. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, temperature pushing 94 degrees, humidity so thick the air felt like breathing through wet wool. Lester was supervising a delivery, watching 3 workers load mason jars into a panel van, when Earl pulled up and stepped out of his truck. The 2 men locked eyes across 30 feet of dusty driveway, and everyone present understood this wasn't a social visit. "Lester," Earl said, voice flat, controlled. "We need to talk." Lester dismissed his workers with a gesture, waited until they'd moved out of earshot before responding. "Earl, what brings you out this way?" "My still. The 500-gallon copper rig that disappeared from Blackberry Ridge 6 days ago. Word is you might know something about that." Lester's face showed carefully practiced innocence. "That's unfortunate about your still. Theft's a terrible thing. But I don't know nothing about your business, Earl. I run my own operation. Mind my own concerns. Don't go looking for trouble where there ain't none." Earl stepped closer, using his height advantage despite being 15 years older and 80 pounds lighter. "This ain't about looking for trouble. This is about $22,000 worth of equipment that walked off my property. Equipment that took me 3 years to build. Equipment that my family depends on. Now I'm giving you fair warning, mountain style. You took something that's mine. I want it back by August 1st, Friday, 3 days from now. You return it, we forget this happened. You don't return it," Earl let the sentence hang in the air between them like smoke. Lester's expression darkened. "Or what? You threatening me, old man? I'm giving you a chance to make this right. That's more than most would do." Lester laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I already told you I don't have your still. But even if I did, what exactly you planning to do about it? You got 3 sons, I got 11 men. You really want to go down that road?" Earl looked past Lester at the barn, at the panel van, at the operation Pritchard had built on aggressive expansion and intimidation, looked at a man who'd stolen from him and was now compounding that crime with dismissive arrogance. "Friday, August 1st, sundown," Earl said. "Return what's mine, or we settle this the old way." He climbed back into his truck and drove away, didn't look back, knew that Lester Pritchard was watching him go, and calculating odds that were about to turn against him in ways he couldn't imagine. That evening, Earl gathered his sons again. Same kitchen table, same coffee, same grim understanding that they were moving past, talking into something darker. "I gave him until Friday," Earl said. "He denied taking it, but he's lying." I could see it in his face, could hear it in his voice. "Lester Pritchard's got our still. He's got no intention of returning it. And he thinks we won't do nothing about it because he's got more men." James spoke carefully. "Dad, if we're wrong, if Pritchard really doesn't have it and we act on assumption, we'll have started a war for nothing." "I'm not wrong," Earl said. "And even if I was, the principle stands. Somebody took what's ours. Somebody's going to answer." Friday came and went. The still remained gone. Lester Pritchard sent word through a mutual acquaintance that Earl Wilson was welcome to hire a lawyer if he had problems with competitors, but that Pritchard wouldn't be intimidated by an old man living on past reputation. That message reached Earl on August 2nd, a Saturday afternoon. He read it, folded the paper carefully, set it aside. Then he walked to his gun cabinet and began taking inventory. On August 10th, 13 days after giving his deadline, and 9 days after Lester Pritchard's dismissive response, Earl Wilson called his sons to Blackberry Ridge, where the still had been stolen. They drove up separately, parking at different locations, hiking in from different directions. Security habits, so ingrained, they followed them even for family meetings. They met at the empty clearing where the still had stood, gathered around the spring that still trickled cold water, looking at the rectangle of flattened grass that was all that remained of 3 years of work. The temperature had climbed to 92 degrees, humidity turning the forest into a steam bath. But Earl seemed not to notice, standing rigid in the heat, hands clasped behind his back, staring at the ground like he could will the still back into existence. James, Robert, and Curtis stood silent, waiting for their father to speak, knowing he'd brought them here for a reason, suspecting what that reason might be. Earl finally looked up, met each son's eyes in turn. "This is where it happened," he said. "Right here, somebody came into our hollow, took what 4 generations of Wilson men built, and walked away laughing. I gave them fair warning, gave them a chance to make it right. They chose wrong." Robert spoke first, voice tight with anger that had been building for weeks. "So we take it back. Find where they're holding it, go in at night, reclaim what's ours." Earl shook his head. "Too late for that. They've already integrated our copper into their operation, can't untangle it without destroying everything. Besides, this ain't about the still anymore. It's about respect, about making sure every moonshiner in Pike County knows that you don't steal from the Wilson family without paying a price." "What kind of price?" Curtis asked quietly, though he already knew. Earl looked at his youngest son. "The kind that makes men remember. The kind that gets talked about for generations. We're going to Pritchard's operation. We're going to shut it down. Permanently. James's jaw tightened. You're talking about killing people. Dad, that's not just illegal, that's murder. Federal prison, life sentences, maybe death penalty. I know what I'm talking about, Earl said, voice cold as creek water. I'm talking about justice when the law won't provide it. I'm talking about defending what's ours, the only way left to us. You think I want this? You think I want to turn my sons into killers? But we have two choices. We let Pritchard get away with theft, lose our reputation. Watch every two-bit moonshiner in eastern Kentucky think they can take from us without consequences. Or we make an example that ensures this never happens again. The four Wilson men stood in that clearing, breathing humid air, thick with the smell of pine and honeysuckle, listening to the spring trickle and the distant sound of a crow calling. They were choosing between their freedom and their honor, between law and code, between who they'd been raised to be and what circumstances were forcing them to become. Curtis looked like he might be sick, sweat running down his face that had nothing to do with heat. James's face had gone carefully blank, the expression he wore when processing impossible decisions. Robert's eyes were bright with something dangerous, something that had been waiting for permission to emerge. Dad, James said slowly, if we do this, if we go to Pritchard's place with guns, people will die. Innocent people who just work for him, who don't know nothing about the still. Can you live with that? Earl didn't answer immediately. He walked to the spring, knelt down, filled his cupped hands with cold water, drank. When he stood, his face showed a resolve that frightened his sons more than anger would have. I can live with whatever I have to live with, he said, if it means protecting this family's name. The preparation started August 11th and continued for 12 days, methodical and careful, Earl applying the same precision to planning violence that he'd always applied to moonshining. They met every evening after dark at different locations, never the same place twice, rotating between Earl's barn, James's basement, and remote clearings where they could talk without being overheard. Earl had served in the Pacific, had seen combat on Palayu where Marines learned to fight in hell itself, understood tactics and coordination, and the importance of overwhelming force. James had been in Vietnam for 14 months. In 1968 and 1969, had come home with medals he kept in a drawer and knowledge he wished he could forget. Together they planned the assault like a military operation because that's what it was. Robert and Curtis listened, contributed ideas, absorbed strategy, transformed gradually from moonshiners into something else. The arsenal assembled piece by piece. Earl's Remington 870 shotgun, 12 gauge, bought new in 1963 and maintained with obsessive care. James's Winchester Model 94 lever-action rifle in .30-30, a gift from Earl on his 18th birthday. Robert's Marlin 336 in .30-30, purchased from a pawn shop in Pikeville. Curtis's Savage 110 bolt action in .36, the newest weapon, acquired only 3 years ago. Earl also retrieved his father's 1911 Colt .45 pistol, a World War II relic that still fired perfectly, and a .357 Magnum revolver that Robert kept for close work. 6 firearms for 4 men, more than enough for what they intended. They purchased ammunition carefully, spreading purchases across 6 different stores in 3 counties, never buying more than 2 boxes at any location, paying cash, avoiding suspicion. 5 boxes of 12-gauge buckshot, 4 boxes of 30-30, 3 boxes of 30-06, 2 boxes of 45 ACP, 1 box of 357 Magnum. Earl kept receipts in a coffee can under his kitchen sink, some part of him still believing in documentation, in proving they'd acted legally right up until the moment they didn't. Robert bought 5-gallon gasoline cans from a hardware store in Prestonsburg, said he needed them for farm equipment. Curtis acquired heavy-duty zip ties and duct tape from Walmart, standard supplies that could have innocent explanations. James purchased topographic maps of Pike County from the Forest Service, spread them across his kitchen table, marked the Pritchard barn location, marked approach routes, marked escape paths, measured distances, and calculated timing with the precision of an operation that couldn't tolerate mistakes. They didn't discuss what they were planning in explicit terms, never said kill or murder. Instead, they talked about handling the Pritchard problem, about settling accounts, about making sure people understood the Wilson family wasn't to be disrespected. This linguistic evasion allowed them to maintain psychological distance from what they were becoming, to frame it as necessary action rather than premeditated slaughter. On August 22nd, they gathered one final time at Earl's house. Sarah had gone to stay with her sister in Belfry, said she couldn't be present for what was coming, couldn't watch her husband and sons transform into something that terrified her. Earl laid out the plan one last time. They would approach the Pritchard barn after midnight, when most of the crew would be sleeping in the bunkhouse behind the main structure. They would disable vehicles first, preventing escape. Then they would move through the operation systematically, neutralizing threats before anyone could organize resistance. The word neutralizing did heavy lifting in that sentence, covering everything Earl didn't want to say explicitly. Anyone who surrenders, we let them live, Earl said. This is about Lester Pritchard and his crew, not about massacring people who didn't choose this fight. Robert disagreed immediately. Anyone who surrenders becomes a witness. We can't leave witnesses. Dad, we do this clean or we don't do it at all. The 4 men stared at each other across the kitchen table. Finally, Earl nodded. No witnesses. The temperature had climbed to 88 degrees. Even at midnight, tomorrow it would be hotter. Good weather for what they intended, Earl thought. Hot enough to keep people slow, dark enough to hide. The temperature had dropped to 71 degrees by the time the Wilson men gathered at the base of Blackberry Ridge. But the humidity remained suffocating, the air thick enough to chew. No moon tonight, just stars brilliant and hard above the black silhouettes of mountains. Earl drove his F-150, James following in his Chevy S10. They parked on an abandoned coal access road, 3 miles from the Pritchard barn, pulled off into tree cover where the vehicles wouldn't be visible from the main highway. The truck's engines ticked as they cooled, metal contracting in the humid air. Earl stood outside his vehicle, breath coming shallow despite the heat, waiting for his hands to steady. They trembled slightly, holding his Remington 870 shotgun like it weighed 100 pounds instead of 8. He'd expected the same cold focus he'd felt on Peleliu in 1944. The emptiness that let you do terrible things without thinking about them. Instead, he felt something closer to grief, a weight settling on his chest that made breathing difficult. This was different from war. In war, you killed enemies who wore different uniforms, who'd made the same choice you had. Tonight, they were about to eliminate moonshiners, working men whose only crime was following orders from a boss who'd stolen from the wrong family. James checked his Winchester 94 for the third time, confirming the lever action worked smoothly. The magazine was loaded with 7 rounds of .30-30. His face showed nothing, the same expression he wore when running a delicate distillation, focused and calm, despite the stakes. Robert had wild energy about him, pacing in small circles, hands opening and closing around his Marlin 336, breathing too fast. This was what Robert had been waiting for his entire life, Earl thought. Violence given purpose and permission. Curtis sat in James's truck cab, door open, head in his hands, shoulders shaking. The youngest Wilson brother looked like he might vomit or cry, or both. Earl walked over, put a hand on Curtis's shoulder. "You don't have to do this," Earl said quietly. "You can stay with the trucks, keep watch. If things go wrong, you drive away, stay free, take care of your mother." Curtis looked up, eyes wet in the darkness. "And live knowing I abandoned my family? Live knowing my brothers went to hell while I stayed safe?" He wiped his face with his sleeve, stood up, gripped his Savage 110. "I'm going." Earl nodded. "Then chamber around." They moved through the forest like they'd done 1,000 times before, hunting deer or turkey, walking trails they'd known since childhood. But tonight the familiar landscape felt alien, transformed by intent. At 11:55 p.m., they reached the ridge overlooking the Pritchard operation. Through the trees, maybe 300 yards distant, they could see the old tobacco barn, a bunkhouse behind it, 3 pickup trucks parked in the yard, a single security light casting long shadows. Smoke rose from a chimney despite the heat, the still inside running, producing shine that was being made with copper stolen from the Wilson family. Earl used binoculars. Military surplus from his Marine Corps days counted shapes, moving behind barn windows. At least 4 men visible, probably more out of sight. The bunkhouse was dark except for one window showing flickering blue light, probably a television. Lester Pritchard's house sat separate from the operation, maybe 200 yards east, showing lights in multiple windows. Earl lowered the binoculars, looked at his sons. "Last chance to turn back," he said. Not a question, just a statement of fact. James shook his head. "We're past that point, Dad. This has to be done." Robert chambered around in his Marlin, the lever action making a metallic sound that seemed impossibly loud in the humid darkness. "Let's finish this." Curtis said nothing, just gripped his rifle tighter, knuckles white. Earl checked his Remington one final time, loaded 5 shells of buckshot, then started down the slope toward the barn where 11 men were about to discover that mountain justice operated outside any law They understood. They approached from the south, using the tree line for cover, staying in shadows beyond the reach of the security light. The barn sat isolated, no neighbors within half a mile. The nearest house belonging to Lester Pritchard's cousin, who knew better than to hear anything that happened at the operation. Earl could smell the mash from 100 yards away, that distinctive sweet fermentation smell that meant corn and sugar and yeast transforming into something stronger. The barn door stood partially open, light spilling out, voices audible inside, men working the late shift, monitoring temperature, collecting product that would be jarred and distributed by morning. Earl signaled his sons to positions they'd rehearsed. James circled east toward the vehicles. Robert moved west toward the bunkhouse. Curtis stayed with Earl back up, watching his father's blind spots. Earl approached the barn door slowly, Remington raised, safety off, finger resting lightly on the trigger guard. Through the gap in the door, he could see 3 men working around a 250-gallon copper still, the still that had been built using components from the Wilson rig. Earl's still, his copper, being used to produce Pritchard shine. The sight made something cold and final settle in his chest. He kicked the door fully open, stepped inside, shotgun leveled. The 3 men turned, surprise on their faces, not understanding for a crucial moment what was happening. Earl recognized 2 of them. Michael Webb, 31, who'd worked tobacco for Earl's cousin years ago. Vernon Hall, 34, whose mother lived 2 hollows over from the Wilson property. The third man was younger, maybe 25, unfamiliar. Michael's hands were full of mason jars. Vernon held a thermometer. The young man was adjusting the gas burner under the still. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Michael's face showed recognition and fear. "Mr. Wilson? What the hell?" "Where's Lester?" Earl asked. Voice flat, deadly quiet. Michael set down the jars carefully, hands raised. "He ain't here. Gone to Hazard for the weekend. Mr. Wilson, we don't want no trouble." "You're already in trouble," Earl said. "You're running my copper, using equipment that was stolen from my family." "We didn't know," Vernon said quickly. "Lester told us this was salvage, told us it was legal claim from an abandoned site. We didn't know it was yours, I swear." Earl's finger moved to the trigger. "Doesn't matter if you knew. You work for Pritchard. That makes you guilty." The Remington roared in the enclosed space, impossibly loud, muzzle flash, brilliant in the dim barn. Michael Webb took the blast center mass, flew backward into the wall, slid down, leaving a red smear. Vernon tried to run for the back door. Earl pumped the shotgun, fired again. Vernon fell face first into a pile of empty feed sacks. The young man, the stranger whose name Earl didn't know and would never learn, raised his hands, screaming words that got lost in the ringing in Earl's ears from the shotgun blasts. "Please, Jesus Christ, please. I got a kid." Earl hesitated, looked at this boy, maybe 25, whole life ahead of him, probably just trying to make money in a county with no jobs. Thought about mercy, about drawing a line somewhere. Then he thought about Lester Pritchard, laughing, dismissing his threats. Thought about his copper still, his family's legacy. Thought about the fact that witnesses meant Prison. He fired the third shell. The young man dropped. Curtis stood in the doorway behind Earl, frozen. Savage 110 unfired, staring at three bodies and the blood spreading across concrete floor. "Dad," Curtis whispered. "What did we just do?" Earl reloaded the Remington with practiced efficiency, muscle memory from decades of hunting. "What we had to," he said. "Now help me find the others." The gunshots brought men running from the bunkhouse. Dale Pritchard, leading 4 workers who'd been sleeping or watching television, now stumbling into the humid darkness without weapons, without plan, responding to crisis on instinct and adrenaline. Dale was 43 years old, Lester's younger brother. Built compact and dangerous, wore only boxer shorts and a t-shirt. Barefoot, moving fast. Toward the barn, where he'd heard 3 distinct shotgun blasts. Behind him came Danny Combs, 26, Jackie Sturgill, 28, and 2 brothers from Phelps whose names Earl didn't know, all of them in sleeping clothes, all of them confused and disoriented, none of them understanding they were running toward their deaths. Robert Wilson had positioned himself between the bunkhouse and the barn, lying prone behind a stack of firewood with his Marlin 336 leveled across the top log, waiting with the patience of a hunter who'd spent years sitting motionless in deer stands. When Dale burst out of the bunkhouse, Robert let him get 10 yards into the open before firing. The 30-30 round caught Dale high in the chest, spinning him sideways. He tried to keep running, took 3 more steps before Robert's second shot dropped him permanently. The 4 men behind Dale scattered like quail, some diving back toward the bunkhouse, others running for the parked trucks, one sprinting for the tree line. James Wilson was waiting by the vehicles, Winchester 94 raised. Had already disabled all 3 trucks by shooting out their front tires during the initial approach. When Danny Combs reached the first truck and tried to start it anyway, tires flat or not, James fired through the driver's window. Danny slumped over the steering wheel, the truck's dome light illuminating his body in yellow glow. Jackie Sturgill made it to the tree line, actually had a chance at survival if he'd kept running, but he stopped, turned back, started yelling for his friends to follow him. James's Winchester spoke twice. Jackie fell into the underbrush and didn't move. The 2 brothers from Phelps, whose names were Randy and Keith, though the Wilsons would never know this, tried to surrender, dropping to their knees in the open yard, hands raised, screaming that they gave up, that they weren't armed, that they had families. Robert stood up from behind the firewood, walked toward them with his Marlin, face showing nothing. "You work for Pritchard," Robert said. "That's enough." The brothers tried to run. Robert shot Randy first, then Keith, lever action working smoothly, both men falling within feet of each other. Inside the barn, Earl heard the gunfire outside, knew his sons were handling their assignments, knew the plan was working with terrible efficiency. Curtis stood beside him, still frozen, still hadn't fired his rifle, watching his father reload the Remington with hands that moved automatically while his face showed something broken. "Dad," Curtis said, voice shaking. "Those men surrendered. Robert just executed them." Earl looked at his youngest son, saw the horror there, saw Curtis crossing a threshold from participant to witness, understanding what his family had become. "Mountain justice doesn't have rules about surrender," Earl said. "Not when the stakes are this high. Not when we're already past the point of law." Curtis's rifle clattered to the floor. He backed away from his father, hands raised like Earl was pointing the shotgun at him instead of toward the door. "I can't," Curtis whispered. "I can't be part of this." "Then wait here," Earl said. "Guard the barn. Don't let anyone escape." But Curtis didn't wait. He ran, bursting out the back door, disappearing into the darkness, leaving his rifle on the blood-slicked floor. Earl watched him go, felt something crack in his chest that might have been his heart, or might have been the last piece of his conscience breaking. Then he turned back to the work that remained. 3 men had escaped the initial assault, running east toward Lester Pritchard's house to warn him, to find weapons, to organize some kind of defense against attackers they hadn't clearly seen in the darkness and chaos. Earl could hear them crashing through underbrush, calling out warnings, voices high and panicked. He stepped out of the barn, whistled once, sharp and loud, the signal he and his sons had agreed upon. James appeared from the direction of the vehicles, Winchester reloaded. Robert emerged from the shadows near the bunkhouse, Marlin ready. Curtis was gone, disappeared into the forest. Earl made a quick decision. "Let him go," Earl said. "Curtis is out. It's just us 3 now." James's face showed something that might have been relief that his youngest brother had escaped this, or might have been grief that the family was fracturing. Robert showed nothing, already moving toward Pritchard's house, tracking the runners by sound. They spread out, advancing through the humid darkness, 3 men hunting 3 others across terrain. None of them could see clearly. Fog had started rolling in from the creek bottom, turning the world ghostly, visibility dropping to maybe 20 feet. The temperature had actually risen despite the hour, the air so thick with moisture it felt like breathing underwater. Earl heard movement to his left, swung the Remington toward the sound, fired on instinct. The shotgun blast lit up the fog, revealed a figure diving behind a woodpile. Earl heard cursing, movement, then running footsteps. He pursued, pumping the shotgun, loading another shell, following by sound, more than sight. The figure burst from cover, sprinting toward Pritchard's house, and Earl recognized the shape, if not the face. Male, medium build, maybe 30 years old, wearing jeans and no shirt, barefoot, running with the desperate speed of someone who knew death was behind him. Earl raised the Remington, aimed carefully despite the fog, fired. The figure fell, rolled, kept crawling toward the house, leaving a trail through wet grass. Earl walked up, looked down at a man whose face was twisted in pain and fear, who was trying to drag himself forward with his arms while his legs refused to work, buckshot having shredded his lower back. "Please," the man gasped. "Hospital. Need hospital." Earl chambered another shell. "Should have thought about that before you worked for Pritchard." The man started to say something else, but the shotgun cut him off. Earl stood there, looking at the body, waiting for guilt or horror or anything human, felt only empty exhaustion and the weight of what he'd become. James found the second runner trying to break into Pritchard's house through a back window. Apparently Lester kept his doors locked, even from his own crew. The man was trying to smash through glass with his elbow, making enough noise that James heard him from 50 yards away. James approached slowly, Winchester raised, could have shot from cover, but something made him call out instead. "Stop," James said. "Don't make this harder." The man turned, saw the rifle, understood he had no chance. "Why?" the man asked, voice breaking. "We just work here. We didn't do nothing to you people. You took what was ours," James said. "Even if you didn't know it, even if you were just following orders, you took what belonged to my family. That's enough." The man closed his eyes, seemed to accept what was coming. James pulled the trigger. Inside Pritchard's house, lights blazed. Lester Pritchard, finally understanding something terrible was happening at his operation. He appeared at a window, saw James standing over the body, raised a deer rifle. James dove for cover as the window exploded outward. Glass and wood splinters. Lester firing blindly into the darkness, screaming curses and threats. Robert circled the house, found Lester's position, fired 3 rounds through the window. The shooting stopped. Silence settled over the property, broken only by crackling of flames, starting to spread through the barn. James Wilson stood in the darkness beside Lester Pritchard's house at 1:15 a.m., Winchester, hanging loose in his hands, staring at the body of a man whose name he didn't know, who'd died, begging for explanation James couldn't provide. The man's eyes were still open, staring at stars he could no longer see, face frozen in an expression of pure incomprehension. James had killed him, knew the bullet had come from his Winchester, had watched the man fall and felt nothing in the moment. Now, 15 minutes later, he felt everything. The weight of what he'd done crushed down on him like physical pressure, suffocating, unbearable. He'd killed a man, not in war where such things had context and justification, but in a premeditated assault on workers whose only crime was poor judgment about employers. He thought about the man's family, wondered if he had kids, a wife, parents who'd wake up tomorrow to news that would destroy them. Wondered what kind of example he was setting for his own 3 children who thought their daddy was a good man, who had no idea he was capable of this darkness. His hands started shaking, delayed shock finally catching up to adrenaline. He sat down hard on wet grass, put his face in his hands, tried to stop the images replaying in his mind. Robert found him there 5 minutes later, sat down beside his older brother without speaking, just presence, shared guilt, mutual understanding that they'd crossed a line they could never uncross. Robert had shot Dale Pritchard, had executed the brothers from Phelps when they surrendered, had fired on others whose faces he'd barely seen in darkness. He'd killed at least 5 men tonight, maybe more. And the terrible thing was how easy it had been. Point the rifle, squeeze the trigger, watch the target fall. Mechanical, efficient, no different from slaughtering a hog for winter meat. That ease terrified Robert more than anything. The understanding that he'd discovered something in himself, that enjoyed this, that found satisfaction in violence, that made him into exactly what his ex-wife had feared he'd become. "We're monsters," James whispered. "You understand that? We're not defending ourselves. We're not protecting anyone. We're just murderers killing people over copper." "We're protecting family honor," Robert said. but his voice lacked conviction. Even Robert, who'd embraced violence more readily than his brothers, was starting to understand the magnitude of what they'd done. James looked at his younger brother, saw the shell-shocked expression starting to break through Robert's carefully maintained hardness. "How many, Robert? How many men did you kill tonight?" Robert didn't answer because he'd lost count. Earl appeared from the direction of the barn, which was now fully engulfed in flames, orange light dancing through fog, smoke rising into humid air. "Curtis is gone," Earl said. "Ran off after the first shootings. He's out of this." James and Robert looked at their father, this 62-year-old man who'd led them into darkness, who'd transformed from moonshiner to mass murderer in one August night. Earl's face showed nothing, no emotion, no regret, just empty determination to finish what he'd started. "How many left?" James asked. "Two, that I can count. Lester Pritchard and one other who ran toward the creek. We need to find them, finish this." "Dad," James said quietly, "we need to stop. We've killed enough people. We've made our point. We haven't finished," Earl said. "Lester Pritchard stole from us, disrespected us, brought this on his crew by his choices. He doesn't get to live while 14 of his men die. That's not justice." "None of this is justice," James said. "This is just blood for blood for blood. This is how feuds start, that last generations, that kill dozens, that destroy everyone involved." Earl looked at his oldest son, saw the moral resistance there, the last thread of conscience that hadn't been burned away by violence. "You're right," Earl said. "This ain't justice, but it's all we got left." The first 911 call came at 6:23 a.m. from a tobacco farmer driving Route 460 who saw smoke rising from the Pritchard property and reported what he thought was a barn fire. The second call came at 6:47 a.m. from Lester Pritchard's cousin who lived half a mile away, had heard gunshots during the night, but waited until dawn to investigate, found bodies scattered across the yard, and started screaming into the phone that everyone was dead, send help. By 7:30 a.m., the Pike County Sheriff's Department, Kentucky State Police, and volunteer fire departments from 4 counties had descended on what remained of the Pritchard operation. What they found exceeded every nightmare scenario law enforcement in eastern Kentucky could have imagined. Sheriff William Tackett was 51 years old, had worn the badge for 23 years in Pike County, thought he'd seen every variation of violence these mountains produced. He'd investigated mining accidents, domestic murders, bar fights that turned deadly, overdoses from pills that were destroying Appalachia. But standing in the center of that blood-soaked property, looking at bodies scattered like broken dolls, he felt his understanding of human nature fundamentally shift. This wasn't passion, wasn't random violence. This was systematic elimination executed with terrifying efficiency. The bodies were everywhere. 3 inside the barn, now reduced to smoking ruins. Dale Pritchard near the bunkhouse, face down in grass, soaked with dew and blood. Danny Combs, slumped in a truck cab, window shattered, steering wheel painted red. Jackie Sturgill at the tree line, body partially hidden by underbrush. The 2 brothers from Phelps lying together, hands still raised in surrender they'd never received. More bodies near Lester Pritchard's house, trajectories suggesting they'd been running, trying to escape, hunted down like animals. The fire department had contained the barn blaze before it spread to surrounding forest. But the structure was a total loss. Metal frame twisted by heat, everything inside reduced to ash and bone fragments. Kentucky State Police Captain Thomas Reed arrived at 8:15 a.m., called in from Frankfort the moment the body count exceeded 5. Reed was 48 years old, 22 years with the state police, had investigated everything from interstate drug trafficking to domestic terrorism. He walked the perimeter slowly, studying angles, reconstructing events. Shell casings everywhere, shotgun shells, rifle brass, at least 60 that he could see without systematic search. Multiple calibers, multiple shooters, coordinated fire from elevated positions. Victims caught without weapons, without defensive positions. Massacred. This was an ambush, Reed said to Sheriff Tackett. Military-style assault. They never had a chance. Tackett nodded, looking older than his 51 years. Lester Pritchard's body was in his house, shot through the window. We got one survivor, though. Curtis Wilson walked into the sheriff's station at dawn, turned himself in, said his father and brothers did this. Said it was about a stolen moonshine still. Reed felt cold certainty settle in his gut. The Wilsons. Earl and his sons. Over moonshine equipment? Tackett pulled out a notebook. Earl Wilson came to Pritchard's place back in late July, confronted Lester about a stolen still. Multiple witnesses heard threats, heard him give a deadline. Deadline passed, nothing happened. Everyone figured it was just talk. Apparently, it wasn't. Reed studied the barn ruins, the scattered bodies, the evidence of rage turned into methodical slaughter. How many shooters? Based on casings and trajectories, at least 3, maybe 4. But Curtis says there were 4 total. Him, his father Earl, and his brothers James and Robert. Curtis ran after the initial shooting, didn't participate in the worst of it. Reed closed his eyes, did the math. 14 dead, maybe more bodies in the barn we haven't recovered yet. This is the worst mass killing in Kentucky history. Tackett's radio crackled. Sheriff, we got FBI inbound from Cincinnati. They're taking over. Good, Tackett said quietly. This is way beyond anything we can handle. This is federal now. By noon on August 24th, FBI Special Agent David Morton had established a command center in the Pikeville courthouse. Morton was 43 years old, 16 years with the Bureau, specialized in organized crime and rural extremism. He'd been called in from the Cincinnati field office the moment the death toll reached double digits. Federal jurisdiction clear, given the scale of violence and potential RICO implications if this was gang-related. But as he reviewed Curtis Wilson's confession and witness statements, Morton realized this wasn't organized crime in any traditional sense. This was something older, more primal. Mountain families settling disputes according to codes that predated federal law by generations. The evidence against Earl Wilson and his sons was overwhelming. Curtis had given a complete confession, detailed timeline, named his father and brothers, explained the motive about the stolen still, led investigators to where they'd parked their trucks. Shell casings recovered from the scene matched common hunting rifle and shotgun calibers, exactly the type of weapons mountain families owned. Witnesses testified about Earl's confrontation with Lester Pritchard in July, about threats made, about deadlines given. The motive was clear, documented, undeniable. But Morton needed the weapons, needed physical evidence linking the Wilsons directly to the murders. On August 25th, he obtained federal search warrants for the Wilson property and executed them with overwhelming force. 30 agents, state police backup, tactical team in body armor, expecting resistance, possibly a standoff. What they found was Earl Wilson sitting on his front porch, unarmed, hands visible, waiting. James stood behind him, also unarmed, also waiting. Robert was inside the house, made no attempt to resist when agents entered. No weapons visible, no drama, no final stand. Just 3 men who'd crossed the darkest line and were ready to face consequences. "Mr. Wilson," Morton said, approaching with his sidearm drawn but not aimed. "I'm Special Agent Morton with the FBI. I have warrants for your arrest in connection with 14 murders at the Pritchard operation." Earl stood slowly, moving like an old man, though he was only 62. "We're not going to make this difficult," Earl said. "We did what needed doing. Now we'll answer for it." Morton read him his rights while other agents searched the property. They found the rifles in Earl's gun cabinet, 3 of them still smelling of gunpowder, 1 with blood spatter on the stock. Found shotgun shells matching casings from the scene. Found boots with mud matching soil samples from Pritchard's property. Found the gasoline cans Robert had purchased, still reeking of accelerant used to burn the barn. The evidence was so overwhelming it suggested the Wilsons hadn't even tried to hide what they'd done. As agents loaded the 3 men into separate vehicles, Sarah Wilson stood on the porch, watching, face carved from stone. She was 61 years old, had stood by Earl through everything, through war and poverty and the hard years of building a moonshine business, but today her face showed something Morton had seen before in families destroyed by violence. Not quite grief, not quite acceptance, something between resignation and rage. "Mrs. Wilson," Morton said gently, "is there anything you want to say?" Sarah looked at her husband being put into a federal vehicle, hands cuffed behind his back, at her 2 sons facing life in prison, at Curtis, who'd already been arrested and was cooperating with prosecutors. "He did what he thought was right," Sarah said quietly. "These mountains have their own laws, their own codes. You government people never understood that, never will." "That doesn't make murder legal," Morton said. "No," Sarah replied, "but it makes it understandable. And in these hollers, understanding matters more than law." Morton had no response to that. He'd grown up in Cincinnati, understood urban poverty and crime, but he'd never lived the specific pressures of Appalachian culture, where honor and reputation mattered more than life itself. The Wilsons were guilty, would be convicted, would die in prison. But Morton suspected that in Pike County, some people would always see them as victims of a system that offered no justice. The trial of Earl Wilson and his 2 sons began in March 1987 in a federal courthouse in Lexington, Kentucky. The venue had been moved from Pike County after defense attorneys successfully argued that finding an impartial jury was impossible in a community where everyone knew the families involved, where moonshine culture ran so deep that some jurors might sympathize with the defendants. 42 combined charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy, arson, weapons violations, and operating an illegal distillery. The The prosecution had Curtis Wilson's detailed confession and his agreement to testify against his father and brothers in exchange for reduced charges. They had forensic evidence linking the Wilsons' weapons to bullets recovered from victims' bodies. They had witness testimony about Earl's threats. They had financial motive, the stolen moonshine still worth $22,000. The evidence was so overwhelming that conviction seemed inevitable from opening statements. The defense? Threes. Federal public defenders who looked exhausted before jury selection even finished, attempted to argue extreme emotional disturbance brought on by economic desperation and theft of the family's only livelihood. They painted a picture of men driven to extreme measures by systematic theft, by a legal system that offered no remedy for crimes against moonshiners, by cultural codes that demanded violent response to disrespect. They brought in anthropologists who explained Appalachian honor culture, the historical context of blood feuds, the ways that isolated communities developed their own justice systems when government protection was unavailable. They brought in economists who testified about coal country's collapse, about Pike County's 40% real unemployment rate, about families with no legal means of survival. They brought in veterans who spoke about Earl's combat experience at Peleliu, about how PTSD combined with economic desperation could create dangerous situations. The prosecution destroyed these arguments systematically. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Brennan was 39 years old, had prosecuted organized crime cases across 3 states, specialized in dismantling the cultural justifications violent men use to excuse their actions. Emotional disturbance doesn't involve 12 days of planning, Brennan told the jury during opening arguments. Doesn't involve purchasing ammunition from 6 different stores to avoid suspicion. Doesn't involve coordinating a military-style assault with assigned positions and escape routes. PTSD doesn't turn moonshiners into executioners who shoot surrendering men. Cultural tradition doesn't excuse the systematic slaughter of 14 people who were guilty only of working for the wrong boss. These men hunted down workers, shot them as they ran, burned a barn with bodies inside, showed no mercy to men begging for their lives. The only appropriate verdict is guilty on all counts. Curtis Wilson testified on day 7, face pale, hands shaking as he described the planning sessions, the weapons acquisition, the night of August 23rd, when he'd watched his father kill 3 men in the barn, before Curtis ran into the forest and hid until dawn. Defense attorneys tried to impeach his testimony, suggested he was lying to save himself. But Curtis's details matched physical evidence perfectly. When asked why he'd participated in planning if he'd known it would lead to murder, Curtis broke down on the stand. "I thought Dad would change his mind," Curtis said through tears. "I thought when it came down to it, we'd turn back. I didn't believe my own father would actually do this." The jury, 12 people from Lexington and surrounding areas who understood rural poverty, but hadn't lived Pike County's specific desperation, deliberated for 14 hours over 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty, all charges, all 3 defendants. Sentencing came 4 weeks later. Federal Judge Harold Stevens, 64 years old, 21 years on the bench, looked at Earl Wilson, at James and Robert, at men who showed no remorse, who still believed they'd done what was necessary. Your actions represent a complete rejection of civilized society, Judge Stevens said. 14 men are dead because you felt disrespected. Earl Wilson, life without possibility of parole. James Wilson, life without parole. Robert Wilson, life without parole. Curtis Wilson, 15 years with credit for cooperation. The courtroom was silent as sentences were read. Earl showed no reaction, just a slight nod. Earl Wilson served 39 years in the United States Penitentiary in Big Sandy, Kentucky, a high-security facility in Nez that housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the federal system. During those decades, he worked in the prison woodshop, teaching other inmates carpentry, creating furniture that was sold to raise money for victim assistance programs, the irony not lost on anyone. Guards said he was respectful, quiet, never caused trouble, never sought special treatment, carried himself with dignity that seemed incongruous with his crimes. He read extensively, mostly history and the Bible, trying to find some framework that justified what he'd done, some moral principle that made the mathematics of 14 deaths equal to one stolen still. He never found it. Sarah visited every Sunday for 28 years, making the 2-hour drive from Pike County without fail, even when her arthritis made driving painful, even when winter ice made the roads treacherous. They'd sit across from each other in the visiting room, talk about nothing important, avoid discussing the past or the future, just exist together for those precious hours. She died of cancer in 2014, 88 years old, still believing her husband had been more victim than villain, that the system had failed him first. Earl wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. On January 8, 2025, at 100 years old, Earl Thomas Wilson died of pneumonia in the prison infirmary, his body finally surrendering after a century of hard use. The chaplain reported that Earl's last coherent words were about copper, about the smell of corn mash, about mountains he'd never see again. James Wilson remains incarcerated at USP Big Sandy at age 76. Parole denied in 2002, 2012, and 2022. In a rare 2020 interview with a documentary filmmaker, James said only this: "I followed my father into darkness because that's what mountain sons do. I've had 34 years to think about whether that was right. Still don't have answers, just faces of men I killed who haunt every dream." His wife Linda divorced him in 1995, remarried, moved to Ohio with their children, who barely remember their father. Robert Wilson died of a heart attack in prison in 2003, age 52. He never expressed remorse, never granted interviews, never spoke about that August night except to say he'd do it again if circumstances required. Prison records show he was violent, accumulating infractions, spending years in solitary confinement where isolation finally broke what the massacre hadn't. Curtis Wilson served 12 years, released in 1998 at age 43. He's 68 now, lives in a small apartment in Lexington, works part-time at a lumber yard, attends therapy twice a week. He hasn't spoken to his surviving brother James since testifying against him. In a 2023 interview, Curtis said, "I was 31 when it happened, 68 now. I've had 37 years to carry the weight of what my family did, what I helped plan, even if I didn't pull triggers. The guilt doesn't fade. You just learn to function around it, like learning to walk with a limp that never heals. The Pritchard family scattered after the massacre. Lester Pritchard's widow sold the property in 1988, moved to Virginia, never spoke publicly about that night. The 11 workers who died left behind 17 children, 9 widows, dozens of extended family members whose lives were destroyed by decisions made by men they'd never wronged. Some found peace through faith, some through time. Some never found peace at all, just learned to exist around the emptiness where loved ones had been. Michael Webb's widow raised their 4 children alone, working double shifts at a textile factory until it closed, then as a Walmart cashier. She died in 2019, 67 years old, still angry at a world that had taken her husband over copper. Vernon Hall's mother, who'd survived black lung and poverty and the slow death of coal country, didn't survive the news of her son's murder. She had a stroke 3 days after his funeral, died a week later. 14 direct victims, but the massacre's aftermath rippled through Pike County for decades, destroying futures that hadn't even begun yet, creating trauma that passed to children who weren't born when their fathers died. The Pritchard property was bulldozed in 1992. Today it's an empty field where nothing grows quite right, the soil too acidic, locals say, but some whisper it's because blood soaked too deep, because violence leaves marks on earth that time can't erase. 39 years have passed since that August night in the Kentucky mountains. The Pritchard barn site is overgrown with kudzu and poison ivy, the foundation barely visible. Nature reclaiming ground where 14 men died over stolen copper. Local teenagers claim the area is haunted, that on humid August nights, you can still hear screaming, still smell gunpowder and burning wood. Parents tell children to stay away. The land itself seems cursed, seems to reject human presence. The Wilson homestead was abandoned after Sarah's death in 2014. The house, built in 1912, collapsed during a windstorm in 2019. Today it's just a foundation and scattered timber, a scar on the landscape marking where a family's decisions destroyed everything they'd tried to protect. Pike County's population has dropped below 60,000, less than what it was during the coal boom years. The young people leave, seeking opportunities elsewhere. The old people stay and remember, carrying stories that grow more complicated with each retelling. The moonshine, still that started everything, the 500-gallon copper rig worth $22,000, was never recovered. Federal agents searched the Pritchard property thoroughly, found components from the Wilson still integrated into Pritchard's operation, but the bulk of the copper had already been sold for scrap, melted down, transformed into wiring or plumbing or something equally mundane. The legacy Earl Wilson killed 14 men to protect ceased to exist. The moment those men died, the copper's value lost forever in blood that couldn't be washed away. Earl Wilson's story has no heroes, no satisfying conclusion where justice triumphs and lessons are learned. It has a father who valued honor more than 14 human lives, and it has a thief who stole opportunity without understanding the codes that governed mountain justice. It has a system that failed at every level, an economy that abandoned Appalachia, a legal framework that couldn't protect illegal enterprises even when those enterprises represented survival, and a culture so rooted in honor that asking for legal help seemed impossible. Was Earl Wilson a mass murderer? Yes, unquestionably. He eliminated 14 people with premeditation, planning, and no legal justification. He transformed his sons into killers, destroying their lives along with his own. He chose violence when other options existed, when patience or acceptance could have avoided massacre. Was he also a desperate father pushed beyond his limits by theft and economic collapse? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that's what makes this story so disturbing, because it forces us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do if our livelihood was stolen and the law offered no remedy? How far would we go to protect family honor when the system fails us? Does justice exist when courts can't help and violence becomes the only language desperate men speak? Earl Wilson crossed a boundary no human should cross. But that boundary existed in a world where moonshiners had no legal recourse, where theft of illegal property went unpunished, where honor and reputation mattered more than wealth, because they were all men, like the Wilsons had. There's no easy answer here, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion, just blood and questions and families destroyed on both sides of a conflict that could have been resolved with basic fairness and human decency. 39 years later, the copper is gone, the bodies are still dead, and nobody can agree whether Earl Wilson was a murderer defending his family or a monster who dressed up slaughter as justice. The mountains keep their secrets, offering no answers to questions that have no right answers to give. The Wilson legacy died in concrete cages and blood-soaked ground, a dynasty drowned by decisions made on one August night, when honor and desperation collided in the humid darkness of eastern Kentucky, and 14 men paid with their lives for copper they didn't steal, and codes they didn't understand. If this story made you think about honor, desperation, and the price we pay when systems fail and old codes demand blood payment, leave your like and share this video. The mountains remember what we choose to forget.